Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. This week, Hong Kong gets ugly just as Paul Keating says we should get over China. Josh Frydenberg says an ageing population is an economic time bomb for Australia. And the Tories have the early points in the Brexit election, maybe. We'll be talking about all of that, plus in our Books and Culture segment, we have a podcast series on a historic Victorian election, Jeremy Sammett's book on corporate virtue signalling, an ancient work by H.P. Lovecraft, and also the Amazon Prime series Man in the High Castle, where the Germans won the war. Don't forget, this podcast is brought to you by the IPA. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org.au and join up now. And you can also look at previous episodes of this podcast. And if you're on the app, please hit subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, and take the opportunity to give us a rating, and please make it a good one. It is time to introduce our panellists, starting as always with my co-host, Dr. Chris Berg from RMIT University.
G'day, Scott.
Good to have you back in the country, Chris.
I know, it's a real pleasure.
It is. Director of Communications, Evan Mulholland.
Great to be here.
Thanks for joining us again. And Director of Research, Daniel Wild.
G'day.
Great. We are going to start, as I mentioned, with Hong Kong. Some astonishing vision over the last couple of days at the Hong Kong Polytechnic. It's really raising the stakes there, Chris Berg.
It really is. So I think there's horrifying vision and there's horrifying fact as well. So the vision has been, of course, the extraordinary scenes of violence between the protesters and the police, how they've ramped up over the last fortnight, focused on sieges at first the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and then more recently and more extraordinarily the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. The police have gone so far as threatened to use real bullets, but they haven't done so yet. So, which is of course great, but is a sign of the direction that this is going. But I think the most worrying thing that's happened in the last week or so, in fact in the last 48 hours, is the Hong Kong High Court ruled one of the Hong Kong government's policies, the anti-mask ban on the streets of Hong Kong, has unconstitutional. They said that the anti-mask ban, because of course all the protesters are wearing these black masks, and the High Court said that it did not comply with Hong Kong's basic law, the basic law being the quasi-constitution that was agreed to when the British withdrew. But, and that's all great, that's how this thing works. But the National People's Congress Standing Committee, which is Beijing's legislative body, immediately responded with this statement: whether Hong Kong's laws are consistent with the basic law can only be judged and decided by the NPCSC, so the Beijing legislative body itself. No other authority has the right to make judgments and decisions. In other words, it appears that Beijing has decided that the constitutionality of Hong Kong's laws is to be decided by Beijing, not by the Hong Kong High Court. Now, on the face of this is the big game, because this seems to signal the end, the absolute end of British common law review of constitutionality in Hong Kong. In other words, an end to a legal end to Hong Kong independence. So I think as we see these extraordinary scenes, there is this constitutional battle going on that is arguably a lot more worrying and shows Beijing just systematically working its political power into the Hong Kong system. Dan, how have you been seeing these developments over the last week or so?
Well, I think that's right, that China's overall objective is to continue to try and subsume Hong Kong and the other Taiwan and so forth into their orbit. They are, of course, a rising power, and like all rising powers throughout human history, they want to exert their influence through the region around the world, and they take every opportunity to do that, whether it's South China Sea, whether it's through the international organisations like the World Trade Organisation, the United Nations, and other forums like that. So I think obviously the skirmish over Hong Kong, but the particular issues that you just raised then are a part of that broader picture of China seeking to expand its influence and dominance around the region. So that's I would say the general context for it.
Evan, how do you view this?
It's very worrying that they would suddenly come out and say, well, that we don't care what the judiciary in Hong Kong says, it's up to Beijing, and it really shows the erosion of what was agreed to when the British withdrew. I think more broadly, the protests have taken a bit of a more harsher side, and I think you've seen from some of the footage that's come out the violence of some of the protesters. Now, there's been some criticism of the protesters, and yes, every protest will have a few people that are out of line, but I think to disparage protesters more broadly with the actions of a few would be quite negative. I think the protesters are fighting for what they believe to be their natural rights and democratic rights, and they see the authoritarian regime in Beijing as trampling on those rights.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things that we've seen over the last couple of weeks is a number of the Hong Kong protest leaders pointing out that this is the last stand as they see it. And what are we trying to avoid? We're trying to avoid basically becoming like the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. We don't want to be subject to a state that does that to its own people. And in that sense, I think, Dan, you're absolutely right. Hong Kong is a section of a more general. I actually think that the Chinese state is under a lot of stress right now because of the Uyghur issue, because of what's happening in Hong Kong that they obviously don't know how to deal with. They don't want to do a Tiananmen Square. They don't want the protest to continue, but they don't know how to stop it from happening. At the same time, they're getting more and more international criticism over what they're doing to the Uyghur Muslims, and interestingly enough, the other story of that is Taiwan. So Taiwan has an election in early January, on January the 11th, and this has massively boosted what has happened in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang has massively boosted the anti-China party, the ruling anti-China party against the pro-China opposition. So I'll be interested in your thoughts, Dan. I think that what we're seeing right now in China internally is actually a state under really massive stress. And if you're Xi Jinping, I don't think you know what to do.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a little bit wrong to see the Chinese Communist Party as like a monolithic whole. There are factions within the Chinese Communist Party, as there always are with any kind of political party, and there's no difference to that. I think Xi Jinping is sort of more of the hardline, Mao Zedong kind of component to it. There are other reformers in there. But the broader thing here is the Chinese Communist Party as it is now is really a Frankenstein creation of the West. Like the West has said, we'll do business with you, we'll allow you to become very wealthy, and they've basically, the West has underwritten the rise of the Chinese Communist Party. So whether or not the international criticism won't do anything, the only thing that will bring it down is refusing to do business and commerce with China. So the question is, will the West choose its moral values over freedom, or will it be wedded to its materialism? Now, I would say at the moment we're too wedded to materialism to actually seriously take the actions that will be needed to cripple China. And that's some of what, one of the things that President Trump has done is actually basically created or raised this as a bigger issue, threatening to prevent US companies from investing in and doing business with China. That is exactly what you would need to happen in order to get China to change. That would bring a significant amount of economic dislocation, but having nicely worded statements that we don't agree with what you're doing with the Muslims, as an example, but we'll still continue to do business with you doesn't really mean much.
Yeah, I think you're vastly overstating the capacity of the West to inflict economic damage on the scale that would actually change their behaviour. And if you look through history, attempts to do so very rarely succeed. If very small states, sanctions and so on can affect everything up to and including regime change. But if you look at, say, the interwar period, the Italian intervention in Abyssinia and the sanctions there, what happened with Germany, what happened with Japan vis-a-vis Manchuria, there were programs of sanctions, and they did. Not only did they not work, some pundits would say that they led us towards World War II. I mean, it is a massive economy. I think the tougher assumption, or the assumption I'd like to question, is really that the rise of China as an economic power will just continue. It will continue growing into an indefinite future, just as Berg, you say they've got real problems at the political level holding this show on the road. The other thing with the current leadership is they've ejected all of the economic advisors who actually opened up the economy. And these guys really believe that state power can drive economies. Like, quite apart from the moral failures of Leninism, we're back to the old question of, can a state actually succeed when they just believe that they can direct investment, they can direct employment, they can suck money out of successful state-owned corporations and give it to the unsuccessful ones. The party is reasserting control over the economy just at the time when their economy could actually struggle. And this was the context for the Australian. Just ran this. Australian newspaper just ran a seminar on China on Monday, and they had many speakers, including Paul Keating, got a lot of coverage. And just the assumption running through this is the unstoppable rise of China. And Keating's message is, just get used to it. They're the rising power. No one can do anything about it. Why are you worried about whether they're a democracy or not? Of course they're not a democracy. They were never going to be, so stop being so silly. Journalists must stop reporting China in a negative way, because we just have to accept that they're as legitimate as any other power in the world order. I think quite apart from the pushing realism as a foreign policy idea to just ridiculous extremes, the assumption that this is just going to go on forever is it's very testable.
And it's not even just that it's not going to go forever. It can be worse or better. That's the question that we have. And so no one's suggesting that tomorrow China can be a liberal democracy, but we can suggest that they could, there is a potential future where they do care more about Hong Kong as an independent city, a semi-autonomous city, where they don't punish Uyghur Muslims, where they respect the South China Sea and our ability to use it as a trade route, where they don't threaten Taiwan and that sort of thing. And I'm not convinced, Dan, that the policy, the trade war policy, actually gets us anywhere to achieving that. But you're absolutely right. We need to be thinking about, with our relationships with China, how can we, to the extent that we can, how can we influence them in a better direction? I think it is interesting. What we've seen over the last couple of years is precisely what you're talking about, Scott. We've seen an increasing renationalisation of some privatised entities, and what I think is the economic catastrophe of the Belt and Road, which is not Beijing, but the local governments and the city municipalities trying to direct investment for political reasons across the world, which has ended up with some economically catastrophic decisions from China's perspective. What we should be doing in the West is precisely what we haven't been, is rejecting those sorts of attempts when they try to do them in Australia, as of course. In fact, Dan, you might know more about this, the Dan Andrews policy of trying to get us involved in the Belt and Road initiative.
Well, we are involved.
I know we are. I think it's horrifying.
No, it is pretty horrifying. There's an interesting point I just want to raise about what Scott mentioned about the problems with state planning of an economy. I think that's 100% right. But I always have this question in the back of my mind, because the reason why state planning doesn't work is essentially the knowledge problem, that you don't have access to information at a centralised bureaucracy. But Peter Thiel gave an interesting speech to the Manhattan Institute a couple of weeks ago, saying that artificial intelligence basically allows you to overcome the knowledge problem. And this is why China loves AI. So it's possible that the Chinese Communist Party can use AI to overcome the knowledge problem, in which case you kind of overcome this problem of state-directed investment and planning. So that's one of the reasons why this time it might be different in terms of the ability to overcome those economic challenges.
So I think there are a lot of problems with that argument, but the main one is it's a misreading of the knowledge.
Indeed.
It's not because we lack the information. It's that we lack the capacity to predict innovation and change. We lack the capacity. A state lacks the capacity of predicting what our preferences are going to be, what the fashionable consumption goods are going to be, where new companies are going to be established, and that the AI. In fact, I read a book quite recently that will pop up in the show notes, and I can't remember the name of. AI right now is wildly overstated its capabilities. Like it's quite a disappointing technology in a lot of ways. It does some magic in some things, but the idea that AI has suddenly solved the fact that we can't predict the future and can't predict future human activity, I don't think that holds up. Now Peter Thiel knows more about technology than I ever have, or he's forgotten more about technology than I've ever learned. But I just don't see how China could do that.
And also, no matter how good AI is, if it's in the service of a Leninist system, this is one of the things we talked about on the Berlin Wall, recent Berlin Wall special, which I recommend to everyone if you haven't already seen it. Looking back at the Soviet Union, one of the reasons why it crumbled is that information could not flow up, no matter how well it was collected, in that case by humans, but maybe in the future by robots. You can't feed it up to the Politburo because the Politburo has already told you what the conclusion must be.
The Politburo doesn't want to hear.
So one of the reasons why the KGB was always the most sophisticated agency in the Soviet Union is they were the only ones who actually had information that they could share with each other. But when they had to actually report it up, everything was distilled. The worst thing you wanted to be was the guy who wrote the memo for Stalin.
But they are getting, technology is getting better at predicting consumer behaviour, for example. I mean, there's no doubt that you go on, Facebook and Google and so forth.
I always go on Facebook and I find ads for products I've already purchased, which I've always thought was a waste of money.
But I think that...
What did Henry Ford say? If I had have asked the consumer what he wanted, they would have said a faster horse.
I mean, and they'd be right,
if
too.
you can predict... robots can't predict consumer wants and needs.
I'm not so sure. I think the coincidence of technology and communism is a very powerful force. And I'm not convinced that we can just say... drawing on the history of the Soviet Union, that inevitably China won't be able to survive with a state-led economic program. I just think that there's many different factors.
I'm not saying they won't survive. I'm just saying that their economic growth will
Can I just go back to
Sorry,
the strategic forum and
the
Keating speech, to how disappointing and ridiculous the Paul Keating speech was there, in telling the media to tone down and to silence their criticism of China. If it were not for good investigative journalism, we wouldn't have found out that a senator of Australia was acting with a foreign agent to solicit donations to the Labor Party and then changing the Labor Party's policy on the South China Sea to Chinese media. We wouldn't have found out all sorts of other stuff to do with Chinese influence at universities. And it is every right of a free media to be concerned about influence in Australian universities and Australian politics. And it is really a contrast of our system, where we do have a free media and they are able to report things about foreign countries that we don't like, to an authoritarian regime where that doesn't happen.
No, that's absolutely right. And it's worth briefly pointing out the news of former IPA Senator James Patterson, of course, Andrew Hastie, who've just been told by the Chinese embassy that they should not apply for a visa in order to visit China on a sort of cultural exchange or sharing of opinions, fact, knowledge tour. And it's very hard to live cooperatively with another country that you can't, especially like a major trading partner, that you can't send political representatives.
Surely that's up to China, right? I mean, China can decide who comes into the country.
Oh, of course. I mean, they definitely have the power.
Yeah.
They
I just don't think it's as big a deal as what people are making out. I mean...
it is, but it is from a diplomacy. But it is from a diplomacy.
I'm probably less worried about the fact that they were told not to bother applying for visas, as the pressure that those two gentlemen have then come under from the sort of diplomatic side, to say, please stop upsetting China. this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't have been upsetting China so much. That's what actually concerns me. Is more is not the behaviour of China. I think. It's the Australians who is saying the way to avoid such issues is to only ever say nice things about them. I mean, if every member of Parliament were to adopt that philosophy, well, then we've just given away our own sovereignty.
Well, look. So unfortunately, James and Andrew have not done what is required for them to get a visa, which is they have to repent. As long as the people concerned genuinely repent and redress their mistakes, they view China with objectivity and reason, respect China's system. The door of dialogue and exchanges will always remain open. That is the official statement of the
I actually
parties.
think it's a massive issue that China have rejected the visas of James Paterson and Andrew Hastie. Regardless of their criticisms of China, Australia sends people, politicians, leaders and alike on political exchanges all around the world to countries that are hostile and countries that are friendly. And for China to not enable that exchange of ideas where, James Paterson has said he does have some complimentary things to say about China. The fact that they've lifted millions of people, the entire middle class out of poverty is a fantastic thing. And we're always going to have differences of opinion between different trading partners and different nations, and to be able to share those differences of opinions by exchanging dialogue and visiting different countries and learning new things is something that we should continue to do.
Absolutely. We need those exchanges. Closer to home, our own Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, made some remarks this week about the economic time bomb facing Australia as a result of the ageing population. It's not the first time we've heard such a phrase.
We'll get to that in a moment.
But Chris Berg, what's going on there?
So the Treasurer was setting the stage for two reports that are just about to come out. There's the mid-year budget update, which will give evidence about whether the government is how the surplus is going and so forth, and the intergenerational report, the report that comes out every couple of years, spelling out the population challenges and demographic challenges. This was a Peter Costello initiative, and now, of course, every treasurer has done it and has to say something. His argument is that, as you said, the ageing population is an economic time bomb, and I'll quote him: "As more Australians live longer, the number of working age Australians for every person aged over 65 diminishes. Whereas in 1974-75, there were 7.4 working Australians to one retired person or person over the age of 65. 40 years later, in 2015, it was 4.5 to 1. Over the next 4 decades, it'll be just 2.7 people in the workforce to one who is not in the workforce." So, that's a dramatic change. His conclusions from this, and this comes from a piece he had in the Australian Financial Review. He's got 3 conclusions. Migration gets a big tick from his perspective. On productivity, we should do better.
Go.
He's a treasurer. And on infrastructure, the government is doing fantastic, of course, as you can imagine. Scott, the intergenerational report, though, before we were doing this podcast, you had some strong things to say.
Yeah, I saw it through quite a different lens, quite apart from drawing on the same list of cliches that Treasury's provided every treasurer since Peter Costello. I think it's part of the wider softening up exercise for the Retirement Incomes Review. I think there's a consultation paper coming out. I've been going back through the commentary. Australian Financial Review, for instance, is full of this sort of the official policy line, which is, the answer to this economic time bomb, of course, is to we need more compulsory superannuation. We need to take the family home exemption from the assets test. We need to abolish that. Basically, get rid of the franking credits, which I seem to recall was an issue during the last campaign. I don't know. It's this laundry list of things that keeps coming up again and again and again, which it's a bit of an OK boomer moment. It's like, boomers, we're coming after you, and the belief that if you change all these rules, suddenly this won't be a crisis for Australia. It assumes that boomers are dumb, that they can't restructure their affairs, the so-called $1 million house, which isn't as big as a $1 million house used to be, is in itself a problem for pensioners. I mean, most people are on, most of the middle class goes on a part pension anyway. I just think it's BS, and can't articulate it better than that. But
Dan, are you with Josh or are you with Scott?
Well, I'd be closer to Scott because he's my boss.
Because you're contractually obliged.
No, I think this is the boomer stuff is. I mean, this is only once this is going to go away once the boomers go away. So this is not. You don't need to fundamentally restructure the economy to deal with this. I don't think it's a big issue. None of those solutions are good ideas. I mean,
Indeed.
But these are. Sorry to interrupt, Dan. These are big numbers. So. In 74-75, it was 7.4 working Australians to 1. And if the government is correct, it'll be 2.7 working Australians to 1 in the next 4 decades.
Yeah, but there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, that's just going to happen.
Yep.
So we just live with it. You're just going to have high amounts of debt for a short period of time, and then you pay it down. That's just what's going to have to happen. There's no way they'll get any changes. I mean, the boomers are the biggest voting bloc that exists. So nothing will change. We'll just live through it. Period of high debt, get passed on. But the big problem here is younger people. So a lot of younger people don't own anything as it is. They're not homeowners. They don't even own their own cars. They have a lot of debt from useless degrees they get from university and can't find work that fully utilises them. So they're kind of like young people in the Western world are kind of like Russian serfs. They're wealthy Russian serfs, but Russian serfs that don't own anything. And the real challenge is now you're going to have a bigger debt burden placed on them. So this is a broader challenge. And I think this is one of the reasons why so many young people are acclimatised to socialism, because they think that socialism will give them ownership of something. They believe that the current system doesn't, which they're correct. The current system does not serve young people well. And so they're attracted to a system that they believe will give them some kind of stake in their own future, which is an understandable proposition. So there is a much broader political economy problem here, which is I think that this is an existential threat to our democracy, to capitalism, and to our way of life in Australia, where basically you have a generation of people that have a significant share of the assets of the economy, whether it's super, whether it's housing, whatever else, and young people just can't get access to those things.
Evan, Josh or Scott?
Yeah, I had a look at what Josh had to say. And his only solution at the moment seems to be that people over 65 should work a bit longer. I think the issue that no one wants...
that's the very manual way of changing those statistics.
Yeah, the issue that no one wants to touch is the pension asset test. An ANU study found that 30,000 people have receiving the pension have homes worth over $2 million. That is a lot of money, and that is money from the pension that is going to people that could afford not to be on the pension.
Surely the solution isn't just kicking old people out
of
the home.
And it's not. And I don't believe in retrospective changes. So I think you could do it in a way that's prospective, and you could reduce taxes on, say, superannuation to give people more flexibility in downsizing, not kicking people out of their homes, but downsizing their homes to free up the market, free up the pension to deal with the issue of an ageing population. And already there are other things we could do as well. There are about 864,000 in financial assets people can have before they are kicked off the part pension. That is without a home. So there are a lot of things that governments could do to free up money in the economy and reduce the amount of money that they're going to be spending on the pension.
I couldn't agree less. And I will, after this, supply some excellent analysis by Judith Sloan, the economist who writes for the Australian, because the actual numbers that would result from those policy measures would not actually create any kind of bonanza for the economic bottom line. So you say 30,000 people with houses over 2 million. Many of them will also have financial assets. So they are already not receiving, either not receiving the pension at all, or they're already on a part pension. So we're talking about incremental changes to the amount of pension that they might be receiving. Secondly, they would obviously restructure their affairs. It's like, okay, I'll sell the $2 million house and move into a $1 million house, and I'll spend the $1 million on hats. It's you don't, this idea that there are pots of gold which can be accessed through legislative change is one of the reasons why chasing these sorts of measures is a total dead end. Grow the economy, give young people an incentive to work, give them a productive economy in which they can work, let them keep their own taxation, let them take risks, let them become asset owners in their own right, build an economic base for the future. That's what we need to do. More taxes, more government is never going to build the economic base that's going to enable us to support
that's
an aging
100% right. So
population.
what I hate about the conversation that it comes from both the Liberal and the Labor Party. You end up, okay, let's see how we can divide it up differently. Okay, the people are aging, they've got houses, they've got other assets. Let's figure out whether they should get the pension or not, or let's figure out how we can means test or unmeans test or what have you, and we end up fighting about whether people get to live in homes and whatnot, which is just completely beside the point. Because the answer has to be, as Josh Frydenberg obviously understands but doesn't necessarily have a solution to, you have to boost productivity. That is how we're going to deal with that. That's how we're going to pay down the debt. That's that Dan's pointed out. But that is how we are going to actually get higher living standards after all of this, and that needs to be our myopic focus. So you see an aging population. I do think an aging population is a problem because of. In fact, Jason Potts and I, my colleague Jason Potts, wrote a piece in Quadrant a few years ago in 2016 where we're very concerned about ageing population leading to declining productivity and declining innovation and entrepreneurship, because it turns out that young people tend to be the people who start businesses, or certainly not an ageing population starts fewer businesses. But it's that sort of, we've got to focus on those productivity. How do we get more innovation? How do we get more entrepreneurship? Dan, I mean, obviously we should cut red tape, but where would you go about starting to try to solve that aging population from a sort of supply side perspective?
Well, it's the standard thing. So reducing regulation, reducing taxes, particularly corporate tax rate, and getting energy prices down. Those are the main things you'll do to get increases in productivity. There's also natural population growth. So actually encouraging people to have more of their own children. So Costello, one for mum, one for dad, one for the country. I think that's about right. It's difficult for people to have a lot of kids because everything's so expensive these days, housing and other such matters. I'm very resistant to the idea of more migration to solve the problem, because on the one hand, you're treating migrants in a very dehumanising way. You're saying you're just a unit of production to pay for our old people, which I think is not a very welcoming attitude to have to migrants. But we've also got like mass migration. Like Australia had a mass migration program for 2 decades. The idea that you would increase that is something that is not very well thought through. So I think, you're 100% right on productivity, and I would say also policies to encourage natural population growth would be another lever that could be used.
As indeed Costello did. And actually, speaking of migration, I did note that the British Conservative Party, the Tories, have now, I saw there was a tweet came out from Boris Johnson saying that if re-elected, they would introduce an Australian-style point system for immigration.
They always say
don't
that.
do it,
No
Alexander.
one knows what an Australian-style point system is.
Well, that's why it's
the
perfect
Americans
for an election
have
campaign.
talked about a Australian-style point system. The British talk about an Australian-style point system, and they never talk about the actual migration policies.
No, but it sounds good. It's sort of like the Australian ballot, for elections. I'm glad that we're exporting something to the world.
Yeah, that isn't like plain packaging.
Yes, no, it is shaping up to be a very interesting election campaign in Britain.
That was an incredibly smooth segue, and I just want to interrupt it by pointing out that was an incredibly smooth segue.
Thank you.
Well done.
Keep it up. Very good. Lay it out for us, please, Chris.
Yeah, of course. So the British election is ongoing. The election is going to be on the 12th of December. The polls show that Boris Johnson's Conservatives seem in a pretty good position. I was looking at some polling averages on the BBC website just this morning. The average Conservative poll is 40% compared to Labor's 29%, followed by the Liberal Democrats at 15% and the Brexit Party on 7%. So assuming that that translates to seats, and the Conservatives and Brexit Party can work together, or at least form government together, it looks like they will hold it. Johnson is pushing towards the 43% that the Conservatives received in 2017, although, of course, the party mix is quite a bit different. One of the big things, though, that's happened that's of interest to us is because, of course, we've been talking about Brexit for a long time, and it's many of our interesting questions about sovereignty and nationhood and so forth, is that last week Nigel Farage's Brexit Party announced that they would not contest any of the 317 seats that have been won by the Conservatives. So they're not going to try to split votes in Conservative-held seats. They're only going to fight in Labor and Liberal Democrat and some other smaller parties-held seats as well. Dan, is this a good move? I mean, I guess there's two questions. Is it a good move for Brexit, and is it a good move for the Conservative agenda in the UK?
Not good for Brexit. Alexander, not Boris Johnson, Alexander is his name, is not a pro-Brexit person.
Sorry, go back on that.
His name's Alexander, not Boris. He's just as he has a fake name, he has a fake view on Brexit.
Wow.
He would not...
I'm Googling this as you speak.
He wasn't pro-Brexit until he saw a potential political opportunity and nothing, he's a politician, so fair game. But his deal, such as it is not Brexit. The only person offering Brexit was Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party. So I wanted to see Farage run against the Tories, split the vote, and hopefully they get up on the first past the post, because only a no-deal Brexit is a Brexit. I don't believe, I've said this for years, Brexit will never happen. Boris Johnson is a part of the political class. He doesn't want it to happen. They've all worked together to slow walk this into oblivion. Under his deal, there's a transitional period till the end of 2020. So it's going to be another year after this, and it will keep going and going and going and going. He's going to pay them 30-something billion pounds to leave. He's wedded this to ideas of trade agreements and all. He's deliberately muddying the waters. So I don't think Brexit will happen. The Tories won't deliver it. They had David Cameron, didn't do it. Theresa May didn't do it. Boris Johnson didn't do it. Why do we think Boris Johnson is going to do it now?
Can I just
sorry, I just want to point out that, to clarify, his name, you're right, is Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson.
Yeah. Wow. Can I just take you up on this idea that Boris Johnson is never been for Brexit and he's a political opportunist? When he was a reporter at the Telegraph in the 90s, he literally did a lot to swing the right side of politics to the point where the natural position for the right side of politics was being a Eurosceptic. He was one of the front people for the Brexit campaign, literally quit cabinet because he wasn't happy with Theresa May's deal. And the current deal that he's put forward gets us out of the single market and the customs union, so in every meaningful way, it is Brexit. A lot of the support for the Brexit Party since the deal is being announced has dramatically diminished. You've had Brexit Party members flooding to become Conservative Party members because they're happy with Boris Johnson's deal. So I think to say that it's not Brexit and he's not committed to Brexit, I think is a bit of a furphy, because he is committed to Brexit. He's running the campaign on let's get Brexit done. Let's make Brexit happen.
But why does there need to be another election over Brexit? There's been like 3 elections. There was David Cameron, there was the referendum, there was Theresa
because of the political deadlock.
Yeah, so there needs to be an election
October
over Brexit.
31 came and went.
No. So the reason that there needs to be one is because the political system in the UK is not designed to enforce referendums against a parliament itself. We're asking a parliament that is divided. So I keep thinking about it this way. Imagine you were a Remainer MP who fully supported Remain, and your electorate fully supported Remain. And then the referendum happened. Your electorate did not support the referendum, did not support Leave. What should you do?
Well, the issue was there was a lot of MPs from Leave electorates that didn't go ahead with that. That was the issue.
Because,
so they should have done.
But part of that is because. But part of that is because the claim that you've made that there's only one Brexit and it's a no-deal Brexit.
Yes.
That's not what the referendum said.
Yes, it is.
In what sense?
It was Leave or Remain.
No,
Leave means Leave. There's no trade deal. There's no Irish backstop. There's no payments. That wasn't on the ballot. It was Leave. That was the
but you can leave with trade deals. You can leave without trade deals.
This has been invented by the political class. This idea that you leave with something. No, that's just an invention to prevent it from happening, and that's what Boris Alexander is saying as well.
Well, let's talk about how likely is this strategy, because this is a strategy, and you may well be sceptical, but the Conservatives are targeting seats like Dudley North which is held by Labor with a majority of 22. So it's held by the Labor Party.
22
votes. 22. The seat of
Votes,
Dudley North
okay.
was only won by Labor.
Literally
by
22.
22 votes. And in the referendum, they voted Leave 71%. So the Conservatives are now saying we're going to get our majority by targeting Dudley North, Ipswich, Stockton South, these sorts of seats, which are Labor but Leave, and that's how they're going to get their numbers back up again. So.
And it's still an issue because Nigel Farage has. And it's a massive issue for the Conservatives because Nigel Farage is running in those seats. Those seats that are must-win for the Conservatives, Nigel Farage is running. And in a first-past-the-post system, there's no preferences flooding back. So it could potentially split the vote and enable the Labor Party to win all these seats they weren't meant to win because they've got the highest vote because Leave and or Brexit Party and the Conservatives are battling out against each other.
Yeah, but the idea that the Brexit Party is splitting the vote is wrong. It's the Conservative Party splitting the vote. That's how I see it. The Conservative Party is splitting the Brexit vote. I mean, the Conservatives had their time. They had the chance to do Brexit. They didn't do it. Too bad.
Sorry. You say they had the chance to do Brexit. At every point when Boris has been Prime Minister, his aim has been to get through Brexit, even a no-deal Brexit. But the courts eventually tried to basically overturned that proposition.
He shouldn't have obeyed by their decisions, though. I mean, he could have just said on October 31, he could have issued an edict saying...
You do have to follow the court.
No, you have to follow the court and you have to follow what the Parliament said. Which
he could have said as of October
31... So you believe in the Chinese system?
I believe that
Just ignore the courts.
on October 31, what he should have said was we're not enforcing any of the arrangements with the EU, so there'll be an amnesty. If he really wanted Brexit, he could have done it. The point is he doesn't want it. He's never wanted it.
As I said, I don't believe that he doesn't want it.
Well, I'll tell you who does want Brexit on the ballot. Jeremy Corbyn does secretly, of course, want Brexit. Is leading a party that is trying to launch a second referendum. Would a second referendum work, Dan?
No. Why do you need... How many more votes are we going to have? I mean, it's going to be just...
That was a setup, to be clear.
It's not going to... it's not going to happen. It's like... people are going to have to keep voting until they realise that Brexit won't happen, then they give up. That's been the strategy all along. Slow walking into oblivion. Why do you have to have a referendum?
This is one of
but the problem is Corbyn doesn't have a view, does he?
No, I think he's very pro-Brexit personally, and but he's not enough of a liar to state his party's policy, but with any...
That's right. So, but my understanding, his public position is he doesn't have a position as the leader of the Labor Party, right?
Yeah, no, and that's the sort of leadership that you're looking for.
Massive problem for the Labor Party because from watching the debate overnight, every single question that Boris Johnson answers, he puts the question to Jeremy Corbyn, what way will you vote in the referendum that you're going to have? Which side will you support? And he can't, literally every question, he can't say whether he's going to support Leave or Remain in the referendum.
In some ways, it's a shame that we have to discuss Brexit so much in this context because meanwhile there is an actual election campaign going on, and which itself is an extremely consequential one, mainly because Corbyn is, the most left-wing socialist leader the Labor Party's had in a very, very long time, and certainly the only one with a shot at actually forming government.
He's done a rare thing, which is look at Australia's national broadband network and say, that looks like that worked really well. I should definitely do that.
And that is only one of the many, many nationalisations he has promised. So yes, so they're talking about So add to that, and you can come back to broadband, but nationalising water again, railways, a whole bunch of things.
Private schools, seizing assets.
Yeah, it's a wholesale nationalisation of the economy.
He's also going to, he's going to release his manifesto, I think tomorrow, but he plans to launch a review into Britain's colonial past. So just a sort of review into everything Britain's done in history, which would be a hell of a review.
Yeah, Wales.
You can read Robert Toombs' book on...
That's true. We have historians for us.
We've already kind of got that sorted. They're called books, mate.
Yeah.
Why don't you read one?
I know Bella can make a submission. Nigel Bigger's Ethics and Empire program at Oxford will be a big part of that.
That's absolutely right.
We have come to that point in the show where we talk books and culture when we invite our panellists to talk about what they've been reading, watching, or listening to. Who would like to start us off?
So I've been traveling, so that means I read novels, because when you're on a plane, you don't want to go through a heavy, thick non-fiction book. And I read the H.P. Lovecraft classic, At the Mountains of Madness. It's a sci-fi horror novella, first published in 1936. It has a huge cultural cachet, I should say. Obviously, having now read an H.P. Lovecraft novel, I'm going to move to San Francisco in the 1970s and take a massive amount of acid and listen to prog rock. So
that was his sort of high point in popular culture.
That
as
is
a writer,
that is exactly what you think. It is. It's actually a great fun book and a really interesting cultural artifact. It's the plot is very brief. It's a Antarctic ancient aliens story. It's been obviously very influential for movies like Aliens and The Thing, about discovering an ancient civilization or the ruins of an ancient civilization. But it's interesting because of the social science. So the edition I read has an introduction by the contemporary sci-fi novelist and communist China Mieville, and he points out that so in the novel, without spoiling anything, there's the story of this alien civilization that they come across, and it's really a fairly strict adaptation of Oswald Spengler's ideas about the rise and fall of civilization, because in the Spengler model, Spengler was, of course, a pre-war author talking about rise and decline of civilizations. The civilizations go through a sort of vigorous stage when it's rising, and then a decadent stage as it declines. And what H.P. Lovecraft has done is actually fairly rigorously transpose that model onto a fictional story about ancient civilization. It's a short novel. It's good fun to read, but it's interesting because of the social science and sometimes challenging political judgments that are buried within the story itself.
Yeah, that idea of the Spenglerian rise and fall of civilizations is pretty entered pretty deep into the consciousness now. It's such a trope that you just talk. Well, Western civilization is still seen through that model.
Yeah, and this idea that civilizations eventually have a decadent phase, and of course every generation thinks that they're in the decadent phase, but
they've been saying it for 100 years.
Yeah, no, and the ancient Romans thought they were in a decadence phase, which maybe it was a fair point. But
Cato the Elder said that in like the 4th century BC.
Yeah. So civilizations
it lasted another 700 years.
Civilizations have both morale and morals. We'll put it that way, and that's the sort of Spengler model.
Nice, Evan.
So I've been listening to the Face Off podcast, which is a podcast by the Herald Sun, by James Campbell and Matt Johnson, who had Jeff Kennett and Steve Bracks sit down to discuss the 1999 election, the election that changed Victoria forever. And in there, they discussed their reflections on the Kennett government, the election campaign, and the Bracks government after then, and what they did. And it was interesting, sort of hearing again about the Kennett era, an era of privatisation, of budget cuts, of big infrastructure projects, and talking about and reflecting on how that changed Victoria, how that worked for people, where the Kennett government might have gone wrong, and particularly in the regions. They lost a lot of support, which they didn't see coming, but the Labor Party did a lot of work in the regions in the lead up to the election. Council amalgamations were a big issue, and something I think that they've come to probably regret, because in a lot of regional communities that sort of is their sort of main point of contact, point of community, and the council amalgamations going through, I think, really changed some of the regions for a long time. And they talk about the structural problems the Liberal Party has now, where they rely on a few metro seats to win government, but really they're seats that Labor won at the 1999 election that were long-time Liberal seats like Bendigo and Ballarat. They've never, ever been able to win back. And until the Liberal Party can somehow find a way to win seats like that back, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to win government.
We're sort of 20 years past the reform period. Do they sort of think about the way perspectives on that period have changed since?
Yeah, I think they, in a sense, they might have taken the wrong message. you've still got a big infrastructure agenda, and Daniel Andrews does have a big infrastructure agenda. But
he's got lots of small infrastructure agendas.
Yeah, exactly. But the hard reforms might seem like too hard now because of all the issues that it caused. But I think if you look back, Steve Bracks actually admitted that Jeff Kennett actually did a lot of the hard work. He was able to keep the economic program of the Kennett government while he, in his words, delivering a social dividend. And a lot of people felt they were left out of that social dividend of the hard reforms.
And also it was very believable because Brax is actually a nice bloke.
Yeah.
He's a terrific fellow. Speaking as a former Chief of Staff to the Minister for Local Government, during that period of amalgamation, I have some skin in the game here. And I seem to remember...
defend your failures.
Jeff, absolutely. I could reflect a special episode of the podcast coming up. I mean, there's hours of material there. But, it was certainly a policy very much identified with the Premier personally. It was an efficiency agenda that did deliver real results, but at political costs and perhaps social costs, made more sense in urban areas, regional areas. The closer you got to rural areas, the more of a failure it was. Does Jeff Kennett did he accept that was his personal preference? Does he accept responsibility for driving that policy through? This was not something that was...
Have you met any politicians?
I believe so, but I think he does reflect that it might have been delivered poorly in the regions.
Delivered poorly?
No, well...
So he doesn't resile from a desire to get from 200 and something local councils down to 78.
No, I don't think he regrets that. I think it was
Okay.
received.
Well,
it was received
he's
poorly
dingoed
by regions where councils were.
So it was the right policy, but if we had have just been a little bit more clever about it,
probably
we could have abolished their councils, but in some other way.
I do highly recommend the podcast, and it does feature friend of the show and RPA adjunct fellow Richard Alsop as well. So.
In this discussion, to be clear, Evan, you are the proxy for Jeff Kennett. So Scott is angry with you personally.
Is there any way
delivering this message?
any way you could undo? Do you think you could ever go back to more of a local council?
Incidentally, sorry, Evan, I will throw to you. But the Labor actually did. One of them was tremendous, even more unpopular than most, which was the amalgamation of the two Benalla councils with the Shire of Mansfield.
Okay,
and so Brumby and Brax just said, "Fine, we'll split them up again," and it was tremendously popular and helped them win a seat. Sorry, Evan.
No, I was done.
Do you think we should go back?
I think there is a merit in some of the bigger local councils. You look at ones in the inner city, especially like Yarra and Darebin and now Melbourne. They've become too big, and they're reaching into all these different areas of politics that are way out of their control. No one cares if a local council has declared a climate emergency. No one cares what the local council's issue is with the border protection policy of Australia, or whether they have any stake or view on nuclear weapons or Israel-Palestine. It's not up to a local council to do that. It's up to a local council to cut red tape, reduce rates, and fix local roads and collect rubbish. That should be the job of a local council.
One of the problems that we have is that we want more localism, but the local governments are terrible vehicles for that. They tend to be filled with time servers and local rent seekers, and we're not going to get that desirable community identification, community coordination from these strange bureaucratic creatures of the state government. Now, that's certainly the case in urban and regional areas. That may be less the case in rural areas, and I'll defer to your view, Scott.
As I say, this is actually worth a podcast coming up with localism. I know
that is a super specific podcast, but okay, we can
Dan's
do that
passionate about it. We do need an agenda for.
We do.
Localism.
No, we should. No, that's a good idea. Let's
do
a
localism. I just
localism.
resent that I'm lumped in with hipsters I'm in Hobson's Bay.
Oh, so you want a really tiny council?
Because I live in Altona, so I'm in Hobson's Bay, And then I got like hippies living in Yarraville.
You and Professor Sinclair Davidson, I have to say as well.
Why do I
holding it up for?
He's in Seaholm.
Yeah.
Right.
You both run for
Altona's.
council.
No, I think he wants to
I'd never get in.
the Republic of One. the Republic
No,
of
I just want
Wild.
the Republic of Altona.
The true localism is the individual, as I was saying.
Well, there you go. Well, that's what they used to have. We'll split it up again. There's coming to you soon. Well, alternating science fiction. So I will go with an Amazon Prime series called The Man in the High Castle. And this is a terrific series, actually. It's they've just uploaded season 4, so I know what I'm doing for the next couple of weeks. It's based on a novel by Philip K. Dick. It does have a sci-fi premise, which is that there's an alternate reality in which the Axis powers won the war. Germany and Japan split North America and indeed the world essentially between them. The Germans occupying the east coast of the US and the Japanese, as well as taking over the South Pacific and Australia, take over the west coast of the US. So that's the sort of the setup. But then, like most Philip K. Dick novels, it's he wasn't great at character, but I think this series is. There are some terrific characters. Amazon Prime, it was their first big foray into drama, so they spent a lot of money on it. The production values, the writing, the way they put the stories together. It's terrific, and there is a resistance that arises in this world, even though it seems hopeless when the Germans and the Japanese are running things. So it's about the flicker of freedom. One of the main characters, an absolutely gripping character, is an American who was in the US Army, saw Washington levelled by an atomic blast by the Germans, and went over to the Nazis and becomes the senior Nazi in America. So, and it's a finely drawn character because repellent, obviously, but then it's just a human reacting in that situation. So it reminded me of that Solzhenitsyn's line about the line between good and evil runs down the middle, and they're always challenging people. What would you have done? And there's every gradation of person in this, from total quisling, enthusiastic Nazi, to people who accommodate themselves to the regime, and then people who basically give their lives in the service of the resistance. And the central character is a woman, Juliana Crane, played by Alexa Davalos, who I hadn't come across before, and she is amazing. Best thing about sci-fi is you get lots of range.
Yeah.
You can do all kinds of things. So highly recommend, if you see an opportunity, if you haven't got Amazon Prime, which is very much a second fiddle after Netflix, but keep an eye out for a free trial. Get it for a month. Just binge watch The Man in the High Castle and see about how people try and recover their freedom against totalitarian states.
Good lesson, thank you.
Good to probably good to learn now. As well.
Learn some tricks.
Good to learn some tricks.
Bury those guns for later.
Yeah. So I'm reading this book by Jeremy Zammit, who was with the Centre for Independent Studies, now is with the Australian Financial Review. The book is called Corporate Virtue Signalling, How to Stop Big Business from Meddling in Politics. A very good, timely book. Very good book to read, very worthwhile, quite short, but lots of good analysis. Basically what Jeremy has to say is a lot of what we already sort of know in a way, that there's big business are becoming more active in social issues, environmental, climate issues. That this means that their focus is moving away from their shareholders and their customers and the supply chains and more to these other quote unquote non-traditional business issues. What Jeremy suggests is rather than having sort of corporate social responsibility embedded in sort of ASX regulations and guidelines, his proposal is to change it with what he calls the community pluralism principle, which is basically to take into consideration the diversity of views that people have around the country, rather than just focusing on a narrow set of views. I'll just quickly, if I can get to the page, read out what it might be. So he says a guiding statement of principle that could serve that this kind of pluralism would be, I won't read the whole thing that he has, but basically, it's a matter for boards of directors and other corporate decision makers to manage different risks by ensuring that companies respect and reflect the pluralism of Australian society and remain open to the views and values of employees, customers, shareholders and stakeholders across the community. So, I mean, certainly don't disagree with that as a principle. How would you go about actually embedding that or changing the views of business leaders is perhaps more of a challenge. But what sort of comes to my mind in reading this and the other commentary on corporate social responsibility is what exactly is wrong with it? What exactly is wrong about a business? You know, on the one hand, I think a business should be able to say, well, yeah, we're going to forego profit in order to talk about climate change or to have hiring decisions based upon quote unquote diversity rather than capability to do the job. Now, I think that's bad, but I sort of defend the freedom of a business to be able to do that. But I'd be interested in what other people's views are.
I think there's two sides to that. So I think if we all decided to set up a for-profit business together and we said, okay, this is for-profit, but it's for-profit in a way that pursues our shared political agenda. So we're going to make large statements about the dignity of work and human freedom and all that sort of thing. I think that's great, and we should definitely be allowed to. Unfortunately, corporation law as it stands in Australia selects against that because it does put things like corporate social responsibility into some of the requirements. It's more of a concern though if we take over a company and pursue a political agenda that the shareholders haven't signed off on themselves. And we're doing so in a way that doesn't act in the best shareholder interest. So there's clearly, do the shareholders know? Do the shareholders agree with that strategy? That seems to be the moral decision that has to be made. But I agree with you. I think I don't see a problem with a lot of voluntary organisations. A firm is a voluntary organisation sprouting up in society to pursue all sorts of political agendas or social agendas or profit agendas or what have you. And I think we probably need a legislative framework that facilitates that better than we do now.
By the way, I don't think it's good. Like, I'm very worried about it. And I think this is a broader thing of like everything is political, you know. So I'm a fan of distinction. So I think that there's politics, there's business, there's sport, there's family, you know.
That is incredibly old school.
Yeah, but I don't think that there should be much overlap because as Aristotle, you know, taught about virtue, that things should do what they're supposed to do. You know, this is as I write in the IPA review. Cricket is about cricket. It's not about being fit.
I think you'll find it's about social responsibility.
No, it's about. But this is a problem when all these things get kind of melded together. So I think it's a big problem. I just don't know what to do with it. And it gets to the fundamental issue that I have, which is, what do you do in a free market when everyone has really bad ideas? Do you defend the free market, or do you say this is really actually going in a bad direction? We're going to have to override this.
Well, for the moment, we can fight that battle of ideas. There's some excellent series of columns which I'm commending, not just because they were written by the chairman of the IPA, but Janet Albrechtsen in The Australian has pointed out that there's nothing new in the concept that corporations can have regard to the interests of stakeholders as well as shareholders. So there's nothing new in that. But what Jeremy Samet, from what you describe, has pointed out is that from that opening, they've driven this corporate social responsibility, and I think we need to come up with a law. It might be another Wilds law, or we'll name it after somebody, but anyone with diversity in their title is opposed to diversity. So all these corporations are being advised by diversity officers who don't actually believe in viewpoint diversity. And I really liked what Jeremy wrote there, which is,
that's right.
If you're serious about diversity, actually be serious about it, and not just say, we've looked at our diverse staff or customer base, and this is the line, the Leninist approach to governing corporations.
That's right.
So good luck to that. No, we'll recommend that, and we'll also put up as a link Dan's article on cricket, which has just gone live on the IPA website, that did appear in the IPA review, as you would know if you remember, because you would have received it in the mail. You have been listening to Looking Forward, which is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. Go to ipa.org.au to join or donate. A big thank you to our panellists today, Dr. Chris Berg.
Thanks, Scott.
Evan Mulholland.
Thanks, Scott.
And Daniel Wild.
Thank you.
And, of course, our producer in the studio, Josh Stranger. We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.